Welcome to Over the Target. I'm Lee Smith, the host, and we have a terrific show, really fun show. This is one of my favorite guests. We've spoken with him before, and we learned a lot and had a great time the last time he was on here to speak about his book on George Soros. And amazingly, he's got another book, The Fact Checkers: How the Left Hijacked and Weaponized the Fact-Checking Industry. Over the Target viewers, please give a nice warm welcome to Mr. Matt Palumbo. Matt, thank you for being here today.
Thank you so much for having me, and I'm glad you
enjoyed
it.
I enjoyed it very much because it's something that's on a lot of people's minds. People who are reading the print press or the digital media. They I think a lot of our viewers look at fact checking and they wonder, well, how serious is this? It looks like it's all coming from the left and it's all fit to conform with a left-wing perspective. And actually, it seems to be part of the censorship industry insofar as it pushes down people who are reading alternative views, dissident opinions. And Matt, you have not only the history and the background of how all this stuff started, but you have all the details on the money flows, where the money's going. And not surprisingly, I should say, I wasn't surprised to find that George Soros is of course paying into this as well. So let's just start with a little bit of the history. How did fact checking become such a big thing? Fact checking used to be something that was done by the institutions themselves, New York Times, Washington Post. It's like, you would have editors, you would have proofreaders, you would have a whole core of people who are saying, yeah, that's not really right. But now it's been moved outside of press organizations into a separate, what do we call them? A separate silo, I guess is a way some friends would put it. So how did that happen?
Well, fact checking started very simply. They were fact checking like Bigfoot sightings and chain emails saying you die if you don't forward it to 10 people. And, in the 90s, Snopes became a household name by doing that. And I'll give them credit. They were very good at disproving Sasquatch and these little chain emails that would go along. But in the early 2000s, and with factcheck.org and PolitiFact and then Snopes, they took on this political tilt and they my first kind of run-in with the fact checkers was I was reading, and this must have been back in 2009 or 10 when I was much younger, reviews on PolitiFact's, I think, app on iTunes. And all the comments were, they do this great job owning the Republicans. But then I went on their website and they claim to be nonpartisan. So I just kind of thought, well, that's kind of weird. Like, why would they target them? And many, many years later, after researching all these fact checkers, in addition to being very bad at fact checking, and being unfair to the right, one of the things they do is they will fact check the right much more often and will fact check claims that, let's just say, sound more suspect. So if a liberal says something that sounds kind of crazy, they're more likely to avoid it because they know they'll have to debunk it. If a right winger says it, they'll be more likely to look into it. And they're very good at sort of duplicating lies. So there was a case where, I can't remember what the exact claim was, embarrassingly enough, but Kamala Harris said something crazy, and PolitiFact's excuse for not fact checking it was, well, some other Democrat had said it and it would be redundant to fact check twice. Well, you go look at there are Trump claims where they repeat fact check the same thing 6 times on PolitiFact, where it's a one word difference, just so they can inflate his lie total. Or there was this famous case with Glenn Kessler at Washington Post, and he maintained this database of Trump lies. And by the end of his presidency, there was like 30,000 Trump lies, but it would get covered in the press every couple hundred new lies of, oh my God, look at all these lies Trump had said. So some guy went through a sample of a couple hundred of these, and there was like a few claims that accounted for something like a couple hundred of these lies, where it would be like an inside joke Trump would make, where we all know he's hyperbolic, we get the point, but apparently Kessler doesn't or is pretending not to, and he would repeat it at every rally it gets repeated on. So if Trump made it at the comment at 5 different rallies in a week, they count that as 5 lies. I'll leave in one last point. This is the people will laugh at this one. I believe it was in Kessler's list. There was this event Trump catered. He had all these professional athletes. I can't remember if it was NFL or basketball,
it was.
But it was during the government
I think it was Clemson. I think it was after they won the national championship, right? Because I was going to bring that up with you because I love that.
Yes. It's one of
Yeah.
the greatest fact checks of all time. So anyway, so the context is there's a government shutdown, so the government can't pay for
Right.
food. So Trump very famously paid for like McDonald's, Pizza Hut, I think
Right.
Wendy's to cater it, and there's this epic photo of Trump in front of it
Yeah.
like this. So during this is the relevant part during his I don't know addressing these athletes, he says, if you took all the Big Macs here, they'd stretch a mile high. So the Post did the math on the amount of hamburgers that were present and calculated. It turns out they wouldn't be a mile high.
Right,
Debunked.
because you say here, yeah, the hamburger's tops, including the buns, are only about 2 inches. So as it turns out, 2 inches,
Yeah, so
yeah,
you would need so many
right, two
tens of
inches
thousands
times a
of
thousand
burgers.
does not equal a mile. Well, look,
Mm-mm.
this makes me wonder how much of this goes back to. Do you remember Jacob Weisberg's Bushisms? Do you remember these at all? Yeah.
Yes,
So
I remember the Bushisms calendar.
well, I mean,
Yeah, yeah.
what it was, he collected. This was the former editor of, well, I mean, Jacob wrote for the New Republic, a whole bunch of publications. He edited Slate. I wrote for him a bit there. There were troubles naturally, but he wrote these collections of books that you would pick up. Of course, there aren't that many brick and mortar bookstores anymore, but when there were, you would go by a cash register. And of course, most of these places are, run by liberals. And so they love to hear someone going after Bush. I think that Weisberg must have done like 3 or 4 different volumes of Bushisms, just compiling the things that George W. Bush said that were not necessarily true. And why no one ever did this with Democrats, with Barack Obama, for instance, who is referred to as no drama Obama. There was never any scandal, aside from, of course, the fact that his spy chiefs ran an intelligence operation against the Republican candidate for president in 2016. Why has no one ever turned this around on? We know why the left won't turn it around on themselves, but why haven't more conservatives or Republicans said, I'm gonna put together a collection of all the crazy things that John Kerry has said, or that Joe Biden has said.
Well, I was writing down that idea as you were saying it. I
Yeah,
think it's actually
you
probably a
should.
lucrative one.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, because I mean, this book it's unintentionally a comedy book because of how bad the fact checking is, but it is also wonky in that you have to go through 10 different footnotes to get through stuff. So that would actually be like I probably have that written just in here. I just have to make it the one
You
sentence
should
version of every
absolutely
comedy
do
book.
this seriously, especially.
Yeah, I think I should pitch that, and there's probably more than enough for
Wasn't
every
it
day of
wasn't
the
it
year for a
Kessler who
calendar.
said, yeah, oh, you just mentioned this, that Kessler said, yeah, but I'm not going to keep up the lies list with Joe Biden. So there's your opening right there. Yeah,
Well, he did it the first
yeah,
100 days to, I guess, pretend he was a real
yeah.
fact checker, and then decided,
Yeah,
never
so there you
mind.
go. Get him to get him to blurb the book. That'd be
Yeah,
fantastic. Get some
that'd be
room
good.
at Barnes and Nobles, the few Barnes and Nobles that are still around, and there you go. Biden's lies. Um, look,
Mm.
what role does this play? You talk about this importantly in the book, but I really want to get to this because because it also plays an important part in the what do we call it, the information ecosystem, right? You say that someone is lying here. Glenn Kessler then goes and interviews people to put together what he says is the real story. Someone else on the right is lying, so Kessler then goes out and gets what's described as the real story, and then whatever that goes to the top of Google searches. So it's not just fact checking the sense, it's sort of revising historical accounts. So I'm curious to know what role that plays in the information ecosystem. Let's imagine our progeny hundreds of years in the future, and they want to know what really happened with something, and it's coming from Glenn Kessler. Well, I mean, what's that going to mean? What kind of role do these guys have?
Well, you're right that it is gatekeeping,
Hmm.
and that yes, they do want to sort of get ahead of narratives. So the search result is one. The biggest one though is on
Hmm.
social media and Facebook, and then formerly Twitter before Musk. They will partner with a portfolio of fact checking companies, most of which are left leaning, and they are given this sort of status of final arbiter of truth. In that, if a claim is made on social media and there happens to be a fact check about it available, someone can either flag the post and the fact check will get attached to it and then sort of throttle the post so that it gets less traffic. But and then also it'll just sort of warn people, hey, by the way, this is not true. And most people don't really read past the headline. But the most sort of insidious part of it is Facebook has an algorithm. And if you have, let's just say, a million Facebook followers, a million people are not seeing your posts. The algorithm will say, if we're generous, 10% of all
Hmm.
your followers are going to see your post at any given time. So you put out a post, some random 10% of them are going to see it. After a fact check, they're going to go, well, no, you're
Hmm.
unreliable. You share nonsense. So we're going to throttle that to
Wow.
5%, and then 4%, and then 1%, and then 0.1%. And it's really 3 fact checks and you're pretty much done. And I've managed Dan Bongino's page and
Yeah.
some other pages, and there will be times where it is like just it hits, you hit the wall, and then a month goes by and you're back to normal.
Wow.
We always appeal fact checks on our page, but it is very clear that they target us. And to the point where there was a couple of months straight where Dan's page was like the most viewed
Hmm.
page on Twitter. And then as that was happening, there would be fact checkers who would go through, like Dan would share a link to his podcast and he would have a recommended article in the podcast show notes. They would fact check the articles in his show notes so that they could then fact check him sharing a link to his podcast because the podcast mentioned that link that got fact checked, so that they could then retroactively censor his podcast, like by this sort of Cold War fact
Hmm.
checking proxy. But that's kind of how they're fighting this information war. And then again, as I mentioned earlier, just giving the appearance of Republicans being more
Hmm.
dishonest just because they fact check them more. One example in the book I give was during the 2016 primary when it was Trump and Ted
Hmm.
Cruz leading, and it wasn't really clear who was going to be the nominee. Both Cruz and Trump were fact checked by PolitiFact almost completely equally.
Hmm.
So they were both portrayed as equally dishonest. The second Trump becomes the nominee, it's as if Cruz, so not becomes, but it's clear he's going to be on track to win. It's as if Cruz doesn't exist anymore. PolitiFact just starts ignoring him and targets Trump. And the reason is obvious. He's the biggest threat to them. So, of course, now that that's obvious, they have to target him and
I'm
not
going
the
to
other
come
guy.
back to something you said before about Dan Bongino's page. It sounds like one of the projects here, which hadn't occurred to me, it's a really important point you make, that it's also about demonetizing. It's also about demonetizing different accounts, demonetizing different people.
Mhm.
Is that one of the purposes of it?
Yeah, so they can not only throttle your reach, but like even just uploading videos can be restricted
Mm.
or demonetized. And Facebook already does a lot to restrict off-site traffic. So if you share links to like Rumble, YouTube, and really anything outside of Facebook, they naturally throttle that relative to anything in network as it is. So it's just kind of on top of that, they then censor any videos we upload on their platform. And I think we're kind of in their good graces now because it's been a few months since they've gone after us. But when it happens, it's a whole month where it's just you're doing the same amount of work for half as many
Wow.
views. It seems on my end, at least.
So you
You know,
say in the book also, I believe, correct me if I'm misreading this, but that you are among the most fact checked people out there in the world. How does that happen,
not
and what do they
not me
do?
personally, but well, not me personally, but Dan
Uh,
and just kind of his ecosystem, and I've been fact checked because I've published through his site, but I think they would have ignored me if it wasn't for that. But they'll come after you for anything. So there was an article I did on Dan's site where I was about naturalization, where or
mm,
sorry, birthright citizenship and the effects that has. And or sorry, not I don't know why I'm misremembering this. It was on illegal aliens being
mm,
counted in the census and the effects it has on representation. And because blue states tend to be more friendly to illegal immigrants, those illegals get counted towards their
mm,
population, and then they get more representation in the House as a result. So I did an article where I looked at existing studies and found that they probably in California have 5 more seats in the House than they would if
wow.
we didn't count citizens as population. And to be fair, this includes legal citizens who can't vote
Mm,
yet as well, but also upwards of 30 million illegals. And what they came back with was, well, it might only be 3 extra representatives, so you're mostly
wow.
close. And I'm like, listen, I get 3 out of 5 would be a D, but it's
Right.
not failing, you know? So, but to be fair, to be fair to myself, they didn't refute the point. They just emailed some professor at some college I'd
Right.
never heard of who said, "Oh, it doesn't sound right. I
Well, I
think it's
mean,
3."
the fundamental point you make is
Yeah,
correct. Something that I didn't know beforehand, right? I didn't know that
yeah,
that was counted, and that
yeah.
that goes toward
Right.
goes toward building the California
Of course I knew.
House delegation. So
Mhm.
that's an enormous point. If they were playing it
Yeah.
fair, they'd say, well,
Mhm.
actually, it turns out it's not 5, it's 3. But the basic point is correct.
Mhm.
This is what the states like
Correct.
California are doing. Matt, we've got to cut away for 1 second. We have some folks who are watching on Facebook or YouTube, and God bless them. But we're going to continue our conversation with the great Matt Palumbo, fact-checking the fact-checkers exclusively on Epoch TV. We're going to make a jump here. It's going to be less than a minute. Pour yourself a glass of water and make sure you come back after the jump, continuing our talk with Matt Palumbo, new book, Fact-Checking the Fact-Checkers. See you in a second. The center of corruption is the Department of Justice. Charles Grassley has been going after them, identifying how the FBI and DOJ withheld evidence from the American people, from Congress, for 6 years regarding Biden family corruption. Where is the rest of Congress?
Senator Grassley, and joined by Chairman Comer, who's on the House side, they wrote a letter basically to the FBI and said, we are aware of the existence of a form that contains allegations regarding a bribery scheme involving Joe Biden himself. Then it turns out, hey, the document's real. They got it. There were 17 phone calls that the source had recorded involving Joe Biden or Hunter Biden talking about the bribery scheme. The FBI redacted that information to the American people. This is the FBI we're talking about. This is corruption of the president we're talking about. It's you get the documents, you get the witnesses, you get them under oath, you move forward. You don't play on their terms, you play on your terms.